Okay, 2 centuries of a diachronic study of biblical Hebrew have yielded weighty findings of, whose significance cannot be overstated. The identification of the varieties known as CBH and LBH has supplied historians of Hebrew with key links in its development and biblicists with one of the most reliable tools for dating biblical texts, notwithstanding recent objections. From Gesenius to this day, the linguistic tool has mainly been used for determining the date of whole books, e.g. Kohelet, or chapters, e.g. certain psalms, the prose parts of Job, etc. The more delicate initiatives of discerning strata within multi-layered biblical texts or identifying later additions to earlier texts, both on the literary and textual levels, did not make the same extensive use of linguistic means. Instead, such explorations were traditionally based on textual, versional, and source analysis. There are, of course, exceptions. Several earlier prominent scholars, for instance, River, integrated linguistic considerations into their textual discussions. In the recent decades, I should mention first and foremost the influential studies by Houston, including the book he published with Handel, and also many other scholars like Rofe, Schmid, Darshan, among others. In this paper, I hope to add to the data gathered in these former studies, exemplifying the force of the linguistic tool as a means for identifying and dating secondary additions to earlier biblical texts. The 3 examples I intend to discuss are part of a research project that is now at its early stages. I came across them while working on various aspects of LBH, including its syntax. These cases demonstrate the potential of introducing linguistic considerations into the discussion of the textual and literary history of biblical texts. The first example I would like to discuss occurs in the story of the war against the Midianites in Numbers 31. The text uses twice the rare word אחוז. וממחצית בני ישראל תיקח 1% מן 50, מן האדם, מן הבקר, מן החמורים ומן הצאן, מכל הבהמה. ויקח משה ממחצית בני ישראל את 1% מן 50, מן האדם ומן הבהמה. The common interpretation of אחוז takes it to be a mathematical term, meaning a unit taken out of the whole, and in the current case, one of 50. And you can see representative bibliography on the slide. This interpretation has inspired modern time maskilim, writers associated with the Jewish Enlightenment movement, to use this biblical word in the sense percent, which remained its standard meaning in modern Hebrew to this day. The exact biblical connotation, however, requires some more exploration. Outside Numbers 31, the word appears only in 1 Chronicles 24:6, where the chronist describes scribal recordings of priestly shifts. ויכתבם שמעיה בן נתנאל הסופר מן הלוי, בית אב 1% לאלעזר, ו1% לאיתמר. The incomprehensible 1% is most probably a scribal error for 1%. בית אב 1% לאלעזר, that is part of the Elazar family, ו1% לאיתמר, namely part of the Itamar family. This emendation follows the text reflected in the Vulgate, which you can see here. An alternative, more radical reconstruction would be בית אב 1 לאלעזר, אחד לאיתמר, meaning Elazar's families were recorded one by one, and then Itamar's were also recorded one by one. This alternative emendation follows the Greek translation, and you can see it here, Heis toi Elazar, Heis toi Itamar. Both suggestions assume that achuz may be a scribal error for an original echad. The background of this hypothesized interchange may be phonological, arising from the similarity between a fricative dalet, pronounced z, and the zayin, pronounced z. A paleographic background is less likely because in Second Temple Hebrew, script dalet and zayin were not very similar. The replacement of echad by achuz, as attested in the textual witnesses of 1 Chronicles 24:6, seems to be a key for understanding the occurrences of achuz in Numbers 31. There, the word seems to be redundant. Echad achuz min ha-50 is better read as echad min ha-50. And ha'achuz echad min ha-50 would be smoother if read ha'echad min ha-50. The alleged rare mathematical term achuz does not seem to contribute any additional information other than what is already conveyed by echad min in these two verses. The reconstructed version echad min ha-50, which omits achuz, is supported by the Septuagint and the Peshitta, who both lack the equivalent for achuz in their rendering of this verse. You can see hena chad min chamshin. Okay. The best way to account for the Masoretic text would thus be to explain it as a case of a textual doublet. The original natural phrase echad min ha-50 has at some point been miscopied as achuz min ha-50. As it often happens, the two variants found their... I'm sorry, just a minute. Okay. The two variants, just a minute, as it often happens, two variants found their way into the Masoretic text where they appear side by side. A slightly different reconstruction would be echad min ha-50, that is 1 out of 50 for each type of booty mentioned in the verse, persons, oxen, etc. In such case, the second echad became achuz. The implications for the understanding of the word achuz are significant. This word is probably secondary in the book of Numbers, and depending on textual reconstruction, perhaps also in Chronicles. Achuz is thus either an LBH word, originally used only in the book of Chronicles, or alternatively, a ghost word added to biblical lexicon by post-biblical copyists. At any rate, the textual evidence shows that the word achuz is very unlikely to have belonged to the lexicon of classical biblical Hebrew. Thus far, I have based this conclusion on versional data only. I would now like to examine the issue from a linguistic point of view. The secondary word achuz means in context part of something, an item contained in a whole. In Numbers 31, the phrase echad achuz min ha-50 means 1 part of every 50. In 1 Chronicles 24, the phrase echad achuz le'elazar ve'echad achuz le'itamar means something like 1 family that is part of the Elazar clan and 1 family that is part of the Itamar clan. This meaning of the root achuz is not documented in biblical Hebrew. It is known, however, from several Aramaic dialects where the root achod may denote part of a whole or of a total sum. This meaning is documented in both more remote dialects like Syriac and in those that are closer to Second Temple biblical scribes. Here are examples from the Elephantine Aramaic. ביתה זי אגרוהי קיימין וחבין וקשורין לאחד, meaning it does not contain beams. ענה ענני יהבת ליחי בי חד בנה, אחד גשורין. אחד גשורין means contains beams, etc. Note that in the examples from Elephantine, the verb ached is active, meaning to contain, while in the biblical occurrences, achuz is passive, meaning to be contained, to be part of the whole. Yet the basic sense of the root is identical. We may therefore cautiously propose that the meaning part of a whole for the secondary biblical term achuz is a late one, inspired by a term common in contemporary Aramaic. The scribe or scribes who introduced this term by way of scribal error into the book of Numbers, and perhaps also into the book of Chronicles, had in mind an Aramaism common in their time that seemed to fit nicely into the two relevant contexts. Textual and linguistic evidence thus sustain one another in supporting the assumption that achuz is secondary in its context and late. The second example I would like to discuss comes from the realm of biblical syntax and involves a syntactic feature that I have recently identified as late. Here too, textual and linguistic data intersect in showing the secondary character of the scribal gloss, although in this case, the problem of dating the glossator in its relation to the time of the original text is more complicated. Leviticus 14:30 reads, ועשה את האחד מן התורים או מן בני היונה, מאשר תשיג ידו, את אשר תשיג ידו, את האחד חטאת ואת האחד עולה. The words מאשר תשיג ידו, את אשר תשיג ידו are clearly a doublet, and despite the efforts of some modern commentators to render each differently, one of these recurring phrases should be considered superfluous. This impression finds support in the versional data. While the Aramaic Targums and the Samaritan text agree with the Masoretic text, the Septuagint and the Peshitta reflect only the first phrase, מאשר תשיג ידו, and omit the second, את אשר תשיג ידו. And you can see it here. This data has naturally led scholars to conclude that we are indeed dealing here with a secondarily created doublet. Yet how did it come to be? The few scholars who paid attention to this question suggested that it is a dithography. This is a partial explanation at best. In light of the recent developments in understanding LDH syntax, I would like to propose an alternative explanation. The phrase et asher, in addition to its regular use as an accusative plus relative marker, has also a separate spatial function of demonstrative, meaning the one who. The first examples of demonstrative et asher appear in 6th century Hebrew, and additional cases occur in 5th and 3rd century BCE biblical texts. Here are some examples. והיה, הגוי והממלכה אשר לא יעבדו אותו, את נבוכדנצר מלך בבל. ואת אשר לא ייתן את צווארו בעול מלך בבל, בחרב וברעב ובדבר אפקוד על הגוי ההוא. את אשר means those nations and kingdom who will not put their neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon. וישבע המלך צדקיהו אל ירמיהו בסתר לאמור, חי אדוני, כתיב את אשר עשה לנו את הנפש הזאת עם עמיתך. Et asher in the Ktiv stands for the one who has given us this light. And one example from Kohelet, V'tov mishnehem et asher aden lo haya. Et asher aden lo haya means he who was not yet been. In my paper on this usage, I have shown that after first appearing in the 6th century, demonstrative et asher is sporadically documented in late biblical Hebrew, while its variant et she becomes standard in Mishnaic Hebrew. And here are two examples. Et she darko lehisaret yisaret, ve'et she darko leikaver yikaver, that which האוכל שנטמע באב הטומאה ועת שנטמע בבלד הטומאה, that which is made unclean, etc. The demonstrative use of et asher nicely fits into the case of Leviticus 14:30. ועשה את האחד מן התורים, או מן בני היונה, את אשר תשיג ידו, the one which he can afford. The demonstrative meaning accords with the context better than the standard accusative one. If et asher had an accusative meaning, it would denote whichever he can afford, with no reference to the fact that the offering should be either a turtle dove or a pigeon. The demonstrative meaning makes the connection between the two parts of the sentence clear, explaining that the offering should be of these two species, not of any animal, as if written, ze asher tasig yado. We may therefore suggest that the words et asher tasig yado are an interpretive gloss aimed at explaining the words me asher tasig yado. An anonymous scribe found the function of the mem in me asher tasig yado somewhat vague, and unfortunately, I do not have time to explain the exegetical problem in the mem, but I think there is one, and attempted to clarify it by adding the explanatory note, et asher tasig yado, meaning the one which he can afford. The gloss later entered the text, creating the doublet found in the Masoretic text. The question whether the scribe who created this gloss lived in a later period compared to the scribes who produced the original text depends on the debate regarding the dating of the priestly source. At any rate, we may conclude that this gloss was created towards the end of the First Temple era at the earliest, and probably even later, and that the scribe who produced it used the language of his time to clarify a phrase he found slightly ambiguous. In addition, the relative lateness of the second member of the doublet, et asher tasig yado, is indicated by the textual evidence of the Septuagint and the Peshitta, both of which preserve the first member only. Cross-checking the textual and linguistic data thus enables us to determine which variant is secondary and to attempt at dating it. The third case, my last example, returns to the area of lexicon and regards the phrase ben bait. I have discussed this expression. Oops, just a minute. I have a problem with the PowerPoint. Let me reshare it, please. 1 minute. Okay. And now I'm going to try and share it with you again. Okay, can you see it? Okay, good. So I have discussed this expression in the past, but today I would like to examine it within the context of the usefulness of linguistic dating in understanding the stratification of classical biblical texts. Here, the linguistic criterion is most important as it concurs with the textual analysis of the final text, but not with explicit textual data. The term ben bait appears twice in the Bible. ויאמר אברהם, הן לי לא נתת זרע, והנה בן ביתי יורש אותי. קניתי עבדים ושפחות, ובני בית היה לי. One in Genesis 16 and one in Ecclesiastes. As I have shown elsewhere, contrary to the common interpretation, the term ben bait does not refer to a homeborn slave, an office referred to as yelid bait. The key to understanding ben bait lies in sources from the Persian period onwards, in which the title son of the house refers to high-ranking agents of a master, including royal princes, high-ranking dignitaries, and household managers. The title reveals itself in the Aramaic form bar-baita and in the Akkadian form marbiti. The originally Achaemenid figure of son of the house was preserved in rabbinic literature, where we find the Hebrew variant ben bait and the Aramaic bar-baita. Okay, here are two examples from Mishnah Hebrew. I'll skip them. The meaning head manager fits well into the biblical context. Kohelet's bnei bait, as well as Abram's ben bait, were not slaves, but rather high-ranking officials who managed their master's business, were considered his closest confidants. The diachronic implications of this data are significant. We have seen that the term son of the house was practically unknown in the ancient Near East prior to the Persian period. While this dating fits the linguistic profile of Kohelet, in Genesis 15, it remains isolated within the classical biblical Hebrew context. The evidence therefore calls for the possibility that ben bait is part of a later gloss inserted into Genesis 15:3. Verses 2 and 3 form a doublet. ויאמר אברהם, אדוני אלוהים מה תיתן לי, ואנוכי הולך ערירי, ובן משק ביתי הוא דמשק אליעזר. ויאמר אברהם, הן לי לא נתת זרע, והנה בן ביתי יורש אותי. Both verses supply us with very similar information, and in both the details follow the same sequence. Yet verse 2 is a crux, whereas verse 3 is perfectly clear and explanatory. I suggest to take verse 3 as an exegetical gloss for verse 2. Each problematic component in verse 2 is paralleled by an interpretive term in verse 3. The florid phrase holech ariri is replaced by the simple li lo natat zara. The enigmatic ben meshek beiti is rendered by ben bait, and the unclear connection of the Mesek Eliezer to the scene is clarified by the words yoresh oti. On pure textual grounds, it is plausible to assume then that Genesis 15:3 is a gloss inserted by a secondary hand for the purpose of interpreting the problematic previous verse. The identification of the isolated LBH term ben bait within this gloss supplies us with a linguistic-based support for the textual analysis. Moreover, it enables us to suggest a possible date for the gloss under consideration. The glossator probably lived in early Second Temple times, where he found the common administrative term ben bait, high manager, suitable as an explanation for the enigmatic ben meshek bait, which he, as well as us moderns, could no longer understand. In conclusion, in this paper, I presented 3 test cases that exemplify the potential of introducing linguistic criteria into the toolkit of literary and text critics. Inspired by pioneering works pointing in similar directions, some of which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, I attempted to show yet again how linguistic examination not only validates the conclusions reached at via textual tools, but also sets a chronological framework within which to locate the activity of biblical scribes and copyists. As it often happens, none of the cases discussed here represents a perfect scenario. Sometimes we lack direct textual evidence, and in other cases, the chronological framework cannot be defined flawlessly. Yet, they all demonstrate how the utilization of linguistic considerations may contribute to the reconstruction of textual history in several ways. It suggests an additional control that validates conclusions reached at on textual basis. It may assist us in establishing relative chronology of the text, and occasionally, if we're lucky enough, it also supplies us with linguistic data that brings us closer to absolute dating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nili. It was very interesting paper. I wish to ask a little question. We find a connection in the vocabulary between chapter 30 and chapter 29 in Numbers and chapter 32, like ראשי המטות, the root ח' למד צדי, and I wonder if the use of the root aleph chet zayin that is very rare in biblical Hebrew maybe is here to strengthen the connection between the chapters.
So strengthen between Numbers 31 and which chapter? Between
chapter 31 and chapter 32, the next chapter in Numbers.
Okay, but I don't think that we have chapter 30, or maybe I missed. I didn't understand your question.
I asked if we can think about consideration of style, of not a linguistic consideration, but a literary consideration, because the author wanted to make a connection in the vocabulary between the two chapters that we can see in other roots, like chet lamed chet, chet lamed tzadi, and the phrase ראשי המטות in chapter 29. He also used the rare root aleph chet zayin to make the linkage between the two chapters.
Okay, so I think now I understand. You say that in the next chapter we find aleph chet zayin, but not in the form achuz, but
yes, no
verbal usage.
Yes.
Okay, now I got you. Yeah, you know, you cannot. It's a possibility. The only thing I would say is that because in this case, unlike all other cases, not in all other cases, we also have textual evidence. But here we have textual evidence both in Numbers and in Chronicles that this is probably a secondary term. Whatever you would want to say about the meaning of the term and its dating, it seems to be secondary on the basis of textual evidence. So maybe if this literary allusion exists, maybe it exists in the head of whoever made this gloss, which we often find. Okay, maybe you have to ascribe it to the copyist who created it and was inspired by what he finds in the next chapter. That's what I would maybe suggest.
Okay, thank you so much, Nili. And I hope that now, Aaron, your presentation will be okay.
Now raise the hand, so maybe just let me try, and then we'll. Okay.
Just if there is time, I don't want to steal more time of the other.
No, Aaron will have his full time, of course.
Okay. So, thank you very much, Nili. I enjoyed your paper a lot. I think your third case was very persuasive. So the fact that I'm not going to comment about it is simply because I find it very persuasive. Just a couple of minor points. One which I think supports your argument for the second case at Asher. It might be of interest for you to note that the passage from Jeremiah 27, the segment including et Asher actually is missing from the Greek version, which according to some scholars, at least I think many, but certainly it's not a consensus, the Greek version is likely to represent an older version of Jeremiah. So the fact that it's missing suggests that it's part of a later stratum within Jeremiah. So here's another piece of evidence that could support your argument. I would like to think, perhaps together with you, about a complicating factor with regard to the case of Achuz. And I think there are perhaps two complicating factors. One which is purely theoretical or methodological, so it's not conclusive. If I understand you correctly, the result of your analysis is that the word Achuz is deleted from the lexicon of at least classical biblical Hebrew. But this argument rests on the assumption that basically the same mistake took place 4 times in different texts. And I think this, I mean, it's not impossible, but it's, I wonder whether it is entirely plausible. So it requires a somewhat complicated assumption. So this is, but again, it's not conclusive. Another element, again, not conclusive, but one just to complicate your life, that there is another element in the chronicler's text that perhaps should be taken into account. And this is the fact that there is an arithmetical disproportion between the Eleazarites and the Itamarites. So we have 16 people from the Eleazars and only 8 from the Itamars. So there is a 1-to-2 relationship between them. And maybe the reduplication of the Achuz in the case of the Itamars suggests that the census or the list of priests there was like a guy from Eleazar, and then 2 from Eleazar's, 1 from Itamar, etc. So maybe there is some kind of a technical term there, but not necessarily mathematical, perhaps a scribal or something of this sort. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting. I'll comment on that very briefly. So first of all, I think it's not 4 cases, but 2 cases, because both there are 2 pairs of cases very close to one another, and that have the same pattern. Second of all, I think in the case of Chronicles, 1% לאיתמר ו1% לאלעזר ו1% לאיתמר must be corrected, not only because of textual data, because of it's just unintelligible. So if you correct it to 1% לאיתמר, which follows the Vulgate and it's okay, then you have the beginning of the assumption that Echad and Achuz may interchange. About the proportion between the Itamar and the Eleazar clans, so of course many commentators tried to explain Achuz this way, but I think even if you explain it that way, you still, let's say it another way. If you have Echad le'Elazar and then Echad le'Itamar, it's a better solution for the disproportion than Echad Achuz, because you don't know what Achuz is. But if you have Echad, it means you're doing here Echad, and then here Echad or something like that. Some scholars suggested that kind of emendation. Hanan, you want to take one last question?
Yes, Professor Handel, please.
Good, thank you. That was a wonderful paper, and I just can't resist saying mea chuz. I have one small comment, and that is on Genesis 15. I thought your argument was wonderful, and it's just want to throw some other irons on the fire, that there's some other elements of arguably late biblical Hebrew things in Genesis 15. And I think your contribution is a very solid one, and I think it makes some of the other ones. It looks like there's some priestly language there. The Amin is very interesting. So it looks like that's, that might be a text that has been played with and has late biblical strata in it in a number of places. So that just encourages and adds on to your wonderful observations.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think many scholars suggested that it's late, both on the basis of content, on the basis that it is familiar with many Pentateuchal and other ideas and terminology. But I think if you look into the expressions that were presented as late, like Sachar, Magen, B'machazeh, it's not, at least by, I don't know, in Bar, who wrote a very big article on this, it's not very well based in terms of LBH. It still needs to be worked more. So I think that with the data that we have now, we can say that it's CBH. And there is also, okay, that's for now.
Yeah, I agree with those. To me, Ur Kasdim looks like it knows the P source. So there's things like that.
Thank you. Okay, so Hanan, that would be it, I think, and we'll